a quick video today about the asylum seeker situation in the UK more globally and what can be learnt from the Australian case, because I think it's touted quite a bit around public discourse in the UK that Australia has had a solution, and that if you were to emulate the solution you would dissuade asylum seekers and refugees using boats. I think terminology and motivation is very important when we discuss these topics, and when we do a geographical analysis alongside a legal and jurisdictional examination, we can probably come to some interesting conclusions on what it actually means to be an asylum seeker and how everyone's playing us for fools using terminology, and it's almost sophistry in this way. So first, I wanted to just highlight the Australian definition here of what an asylum seeker and a refugee is, and that an asylum seeker is a person who's fled their own country and applied for protection as a refugee. And that is, it's according to the statutes of the UN, which is not a real body, but that's fine, whereby they're apparently well-founded fear of being persecuted due to race, religion, nationality, member of a social group, or political opinion. So very loose, very uneasy to verify definitions around why someone would not want to be where they are. There are absolutely cases of genuine refuge being sought by people in certain corners of the world, and you can see someone like Edward Snowden, who's a refugee from the American government, rightly or wrongly, and you can see a lot of displacement from genuine war zones. So there's large refugee camps which are on neighboring countries throughout, say, Africa and South America, etc. So what we can understand by refugees is fairly simple from a intuitive sense of, if there's a war, you probably don't want to be involved, therefore you go away from the war. Now, the West has not had any wars in its borders for a very long time. The largest, you could say, combat zone in proximity to the West was probably the Balkans, and America participated through NATO in bombing Bosnia and Herzegovina. So those displaced by that war would have made sense to be distributed amongst neighboring countries, in which case it was mostly European ones, and so I think there's a fairly well understood regard to that situation. However, there have been several other wars post facto, the scenario in the old Yugoslavia, where we can see now there's a surfeit of third worlders basically trying to flee their countries for a better life elsewhere. Now, no one is knocking, I think, the intent of we want a better life. I think everyone's of the opinion that they always want a better life. Everyone does. But I think where we go wrong is the inability for the West to understand what it means to have both a fifth column, but also undermining social institutions and structures that are based on both community goodwill and also finances, and how we are more or less mortgaging our current situation against the future, and that the preceding generations will be much worse off if we continue to allow our white guilt to eat away at us. So in the Australian case, to give some context, what was happening throughout the last 2 decades is that you had a large number of boats coming out of Indonesia, and you see the islands to Indonesia to Australia is actually quite close. There's not that much water to cross, so you can have a rickety old fishing vessel take 50 to 150 people across the water here, reach Australian shores, and then register as an asylum seeker. The same thing, obviously very reminiscent of what's happening in the UK at the moment. Australia was inundated with refugees, and you can see down here that there was several thousand boats and several thousand people coming each and every year. A large crisis under the Howard government here in the early 2000s, which led to a very sharp decrease due to the extreme measures that John Howard was able to take, and then, as you see, a rise here off the back of a Labour government into a new Liberal coalition government, where there was, as you see, another increasing amount of people taking boats. what we can think of is that there must have been a war near Australia for there to be so many people needing refuge, right? But as you can see here, that most of the claims are from countries which are just poor. Now, why would poor people want to flee to a very rich country? It's a very simple one. And so the idea then is that these are queue jumpers, and this is a very common term back in Australia in the early 2000s, that asylum seekers were really just queue jumpers. They didn't want to apply for the regular migration process. The idea was that you could just swim there, float there, boat there, and thus you would be given free housing until you got the visa that you required, in which case after then you would bring your family over and just start your life anew in Australia with much better prospects around economics. This completely undermines obviously any immigration and visa program you might have, because you're taking in unknown people with unknown backgrounds and completely displacing any sort of community you might have had in those areas. And you have large build-ups of ethnic enclaves as a kind of natural reaction to new migrants. So there was a lot of crime centered around different ethnicities in Australia in their different suburbs that they were living in Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane, etc. And you can see here that the most of the applications are coming from Malaysia and China, and slightly making sense as Malaysia is fairly close. But now we have the question, which beggars a bit of disbelief here, as to how does Malaysia, a country which is ostensibly functional and majority Muslim, want 40,000 people to sail to Australia, particularly when conjoined to Malaysia is Singapore, a country much richer than Australia on a GDP per capita basis. And when we go into a bit of the details and data, we can see here that the number of refugees applying for asylum in Singapore was 2 in 2019, whereas there was, as you can see here, at least 22,000, at least what it looks like 2013. So by a factor of 10,000 almost more percent, you have refugees coming from this area all the way down on a dangerous boat journey to Australia rather than going to Singapore. Singapore does not currently abide by UN mandates on immigration, I wonder why, and thus has no need and has no compulsion to take refugees as willed by anyone else in international court. Australia is basically Western European in the way that it operates, and its legislation is very close to England, and that the political situation is, as I say, a derivation of the UK and American systems. So when you consider that, you have the reaction very similar to the English reaction to boats and boat seekers, in that I think a lot of you might want to say goody two-shoes, but those with very charitable, bleeding hearts would love to take as many as possible. They see poor brown people falling in the water on a boat, and they say, oh no, please go and save them, bring more in. There's no limit to our funds, therefore there's no limit to our space, therefore there's plenty for everyone here in, we might call it the utopia, to take a phrase out of Thomas More. But from reality's perspective, obviously it's just an influx and resource strain, and that the ability to process X many visas and asylum seeker applications is, well, it's not feasible from one point of view. You don't have the bureaucracy set up to do such a thing. But secondly, it's just illogical. And so the idea that any of these people would need to flee to Australia is nonsensical, and literally every single one of them here, other than maybe very extreme cases of legitimate persecuted minorities, say homosexuals in very stringent Muslim countries or Hindu countries, would be required to seek asylum. Otherwise, as we all know, there's plenty of other places very close to those countries which would have taken a Chinese person, say Taiwan or Japan or Korea or Vietnam, and vice versa, India obviously being a complete joke on this list. And then the secondary relation to the UK specifically here is understanding where the UK is situated geographically. So this little island, and I can zoom in here so we can get just a very good appreciation of what exactly this means. But we should say, this little tiny island, here we go. This little tiny island all the way up here in northwestern Europe is taking applications from the area here, the area here, and the area here. So someone is required to get all the way up to here to traverse mountainous and deserted terrain all the way through the continental space between Western Asia and Europe, or they're going to take a boat from what is Libya, Algeria, or Morocco into southern Europe, and then obviously going through France. But at no point are they refugees, because a refugee would apply via the airport, because there is a very strict, and it was understood, stringent guideline around applications for a refugee visa. The Ukraine, most of those followed that process and were able to get authorized visas, and you can see that none of the Ukraine asylum seekers had to traverse the whole of Europe to get to the UK. They flew there because they obviously followed a process, and there was a visa in place which reflected the war-torn status of the Ukraine. Every other single person from any of these areas is just here to cheat you. They're here to take jobs, they're here to undercut, and they're here to be criminals, because there's no other economic function that they serve. They're not doctors, they're not scientists, they're really there just so they can have an easier time at things. Now, you politically have to make the decision on whether you'll support that or not. If that is the direction you want to go with your country, and you say, please, everybody come in, men between ages 18 or 45, with no history of education, employment, or any sort of skill set, please come into our country. We're willing to help you from what it is that they're claiming asylum from. You couldn't ask me and I couldn't tell you. And particularly when you see, obviously, that if you are fleeing from, as I say, any country here, the neighboring country is obviously willing to harbour you. So that is the kind of the crux and the entire point of this exercise, is to say, if you've had enough, then you need to express that, and if you're willing to continue to take these men, then you need to continue what you're doing, because it's working, and the policies in place are reflecting exactly what your wants and wills are.